The story of how German prisoners of war were treated during the Second World War cannot be understood without first returning to the long historical traditions that shaped how nations viewed captivity, honor, and responsibility. Long before the first German soldier surrendered to American or Soviet forces, the foundations for radically different prisoner experiences had already been laid. These foundations were not created in the heat of battle, but in political systems, military cultures, and historical memories stretching back decades, even centuries. In the Western world, particularly in the United States, the treatment of prisoners of war was closely tied to legal frameworks and institutional habits that emphasized order, accountability, and long-term strategic thinking. The United States had entered the 20th century with a strong belief that war should be regulated, even when it was brutal. International conventions, such as the Hague and Geneva Conventions, were not abstract ideals to American planners. They were operational guidelines. Long before American troops landed in Europe, the U.S. Army had manuals detailing how prisoners should be processed, housed, fed, and monitored. These procedures were taught, rehearsed, and enforced not out of sympathy alone, but because American leaders believed discipline and legality strengthened military effectiveness. Germany, on the other hand, entered the war with a very different experience on the Eastern Front. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was conceived from the outset as an ideological and racial struggle, not a conventional military contest. German soldiers invading the Soviet Union in 1941 were exposed to propaganda that portrayed the conflict as a war of annihilation. The Soviet state was depicted as subhuman, criminal, and illegitimate. This dehumanization did not remain theoretical. It shaped behavior on the ground and created a cycle of violence that would later be mirrored in the treatment of German prisoners captured by Soviet forces. The United States was not part of this ideological war in the same way. When American forces began capturing German soldiers in North Africa and later in Europe, they did so within a framework that viewed those soldiers as defeated enemy combatants, not existential enemies. American propaganda focused on defeating the Nazi regime, not exterminating the German people. This distinction mattered enormously. It allowed American troops to separate ideology from individual soldiers, making humane treatment not only possible but expected. From the first large-scale captures of German troops, American prisoner handling followed a predictable pattern. Soldiers were disarmed, searched, registered, and transported to temporary holding areas before being moved to more permanent camps. These camps were often located far from the front lines, sometimes even on American soil. Food rations, while not luxurious, were generally consistent and sufficient. Medical care was provided according to military standards. Prisoners were required to work, but the labor was regulated, compensated with small wages or privileges, and conducted under supervision. For many German prisoners, this experience was shocking. Nazi propaganda had warned them that capture by the Western Allies would result in torture or execution. Instead, they encountered order, routine, and a degree of personal safety they had not known for years. Letters were allowed. Religious services were organized. Sports and cultural activities emerged organically in many camps. These conditions were not acts of generosity alone. They were tools of control. Well-fed, occupied prisoners were less likely to revolt, escape, or sabotage. Humane treatment served American interests as much as moral ideals. The Soviet experience was fundamentally different. When German soldiers were captured by Red Army forces, they entered a system shaped by years of brutal warfare, mass suffering, and deep resentment. The Soviet Union had endured catastrophic losses. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians died through starvation, execution, or forced labor. The memory of German occupation was raw and personal for Soviet soldiers. Many had lost families, homes, and entire communities. When they captured German troops, they did not see neutral prisoners. They saw representatives of an invading force that had brought unimaginable destruction. The Soviet state itself was poorly equipped to manage large numbers of prisoners humanely. The infrastructure simply did not exist. The Soviet economy was stretched to its limits, feeding its own population. Transport networks were damaged. Housing was scarce. Medical supplies were limited. Even if humane intentions had existed, the capacity to implement them was severely constrained. In practice, German prisoners were often marched long distances with little food, exposed to harsh weather, and housed in makeshift camps that offered minimal protection. Soviet policy toward prisoners was also shaped by political suspicion. The Soviet system viewed surrender with deep distrust. Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans were often treated as traitors upon their return. This attitude extended to enemy prisoners as well. Captured German soldiers were seen not just as defeated enemies, but as potential threats, saboteurs, or symbols of fascist aggression. Harsh discipline was considered necessary to maintain control. Mortality rates among German prisoners held by the Soviets were dramatically higher than those held by the Americans. Disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure took a heavy toll. Work assignments were often physically demanding, including reconstruction, mining, and industrial labor. Food rations were minimal and closely tied to work output. Those who could not work effectively often received less food, creating a deadly cycle of weakness and starvation. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment was not lost on German soldiers themselves. Accounts from former prisoners repeatedly describe a sense of relief upon capture by American forces and fear when facing Soviet units. Some German soldiers attempted to surrender specifically to Western Allied troops, even at great personal risk. This behavior was driven not by loyalty to one enemy over another, but by survival instincts shaped by widely known differences in treatment. American policy also benefited from distance. The United States had not experienced German occupation on its own soil. American civilians had not seen their cities burned or their families executed by German forces. This distance allowed for a more detached, procedural approach to prisoners. The war was brutal, but it was not personal in the same way it was for the Soviet Union. This emotional separation made adherence to legal norms easier to maintain. It is important to recognize that American treatment of German prisoners was not universally kind or perfect. Instances of abuse occurred. Conditions varied between camps. Racial and ethnic prejudices influenced behavior in some cases. Yet, as a system, American prisoner handling aimed for consistency and control rather than punishment. Oversight mechanisms existed. Violations could be investigated. The goal was to manage prisoners efficiently until the war ended. The Soviet system, by contrast, was shaped by scarcity and trauma. The Red Army had fought a war of survival. Soviet leadership prioritized reconstruction and security over prisoner welfare. German prisoners were viewed as a labor resource to be exploited for rebuilding a devastated country. Survival was often secondary to productivity. In this environment, suffering was not always intentional, but it was accepted as inevitable. By the time the war ended, the divergent experiences of German prisoners had become starkly clear. Those held by the Americans often returned home weakened but alive, with memories of captivity that included hardship but also structure and survival. Those held by the Soviets faced years of forced labor, prolonged detention, and, for many, death before repatriation was even considered. The reasons for this difference lay not in the character of individual soldiers alone, but in the systems that governed them. Legal tradition, logistical capacity, ideological framing, and historical experience all combined to shape how prisoners were treated. The American system emphasized regulation and long-term stability. The Soviet system reflected trauma, scarcity, and suspicion born from unprecedented destruction. Understanding this contrast requires looking beyond simple notions of good and bad. Both systems operated within the realities they faced. Yet the outcome for German prisoners was undeniably shaped by where they fell into captivity. The same soldier, captured on different fronts, could experience survival or death based on the structures and beliefs of the power that held him. This reality would leave a lasting imprint on post-war memory, and continues to shape how the war is understood today. As the war expanded and the number of German prisoners grew into the millions, the differences between American and Soviet handling of captivity became even more pronounced. What began as contrasting philosophies hardened into two completely separate systems, each shaped by its own priorities, fears, and material realities. For German soldiers, captivity was no longer a single experience. It was a fork in the road that led to radically different outcomes depending on who captured them. In the American system, prisoner camps evolved into carefully regulated environments designed to be predictable and stable. Order was the central principle. Camps were structured around routines that governed every aspect of daily life. Wake-up calls, roll calls, meals, work details, and recreation followed schedules that rarely changed. This predictability was intentional. American authorities understood that uncertainty bred unrest. By providing structure, they reduced the risk of rebellion, escape attempts, and violence. Prisoners knew what to expect each day, and that knowledge alone eased tension. Food played a critical role in this system. American prisoners of war generally received rations comparable in quantity and nutritional value to those given to American soldiers stationed in rear areas. While shortages occasionally occurred, especially toward the end of the war, starvation was not a systemic feature of American captivity. Meals were simple but sufficient. Bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee or substitutes were common. For many German prisoners, this was the first time in years they had eaten regularly. The contrast with frontline deprivation was stark. Medical care further reinforced the difference. American camps maintained medical facilities staffed by trained personnel. Prisoners received treatment for wounds, illness, and chronic conditions. Preventive measures such as vaccinations and sanitation protocols were implemented to limit disease outbreaks. These practices were not acts of charity. Disease threatened camp stability. Healthy prisoners were easier to control, more productive as laborers, and less likely to die in large numbers, which would have created political and administrative complications. Labor itself was another defining feature. German prisoners in American custody were required to work, but the nature of that work was regulated. They were employed in agriculture, construction, maintenance, and other non-combat roles. International law prohibited forced labor directly related to the war effort, and American authorities generally adhered to these rules. Prisoners were compensated with small wages or privileges, which could be used to purchase goods from camp canteens. This created a limited but meaningful sense of agency within captivity. The psychological environment of American camps reflected these policies. While prisoners were confined and under guard, they were not subjected to constant terror. Discipline existed, but it was codified. Punishments followed procedures. Guard were trained to maintain control rather than inflict suffering. This did not eliminate abuse, but it limited its scope. Complaints could be filed. Inspections occurred. The system contained mechanisms, however imperfect, to correct excesses. The Soviet approach unfolded in an entirely different context. The sheer scale of destruction on the Eastern Front overwhelmed any attempt at systematic prisoner care. Captured German soldiers often began their captivity with forced marches lasting days or weeks. Food was scarce. Shelter was minimal. Many died before reaching camps. These deaths were not recorded as extraordinary events. They were absorbed into the massive human losses that defined the war in the East. Once inside Soviet camps, German prisoners encountered conditions shaped by scarcity rather than regulation. Camps were often improvised, repurposed from existing facilities, or hastily constructed. Overcrowding was common. Sanitation was poor. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly. The Soviet state simply lacked the resources to provide consistent care, and prisoner welfare was not prioritized. Labor under Soviet captivity was far harsher. German prisoners were assigned to physically demanding work in mines, forests, factories, and reconstruction projects. These tasks were essential to rebuilding a devastated economy. Productivity was emphasized over survival. Food rations were often tied directly to output. Prisoners who weakened received less food, further reducing their ability to work. This vicious cycle claimed countless lives. The psychological climate of Soviet camps reflected the trauma of the war itself. Guards were often veterans who had witnessed atrocities firsthand. Their behavior was shaped by anger, grief, and resentment. Discipline was enforced through intimidation and punishment. The line between control and cruelty was frequently crossed. For prisoners, the constant threat of violence compounded physical suffering. Time also played a crucial role. American captivity typically lasted until the end of the war, after which repatriation proceeded relatively quickly. German prisoners in the United States began returning home within months of Germany's surrender. For those held by the Soviets, captivity often stretched on for years. Many were not released until the early 1950s. This prolonged detention magnified the cumulative effects of malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. Ideology further shaped Soviet treatment. The Soviet system viewed German prisoners as representatives of fascism, an ideology blamed for immense suffering. This framing justified harsh treatment in the eyes of many officials and guards. Prisoners were not just enemy soldiers. They were symbols of an enemy worldview. This perception reduced empathy and reinforced policies that prioritized exploitation over rehabilitation. American ideology operated differently. While Nazism was condemned, American propaganda distinguished between the Nazi leadership and ordinary German soldiers. This distinction was not always applied consistently, but it existed as a guiding principle. Re-education programs in American camps aimed to expose prisoners to democratic ideas, newspapers, and discussions. The goal was not only to manage prisoners during the war, but to influence post-war attitudes. This long-term perspective shaped daily treatment. The contrast between these systems became widely known among German troops as the war progressed. Stories circulated rapidly. Soldiers shared rumors and first-hand accounts. Surrender decisions were influenced by this knowledge. Units cut off in the West often held out just long enough to reach American lines, avoiding capture by Soviet forces. This behavior underscores how deeply treatment expectations affected wartime behavior. For the Soviets, this reality was largely irrelevant. Their primary concern was defeating Germany and rebuilding their own country. Prisoner welfare ranked low on the list of priorities. The scale of devastation overshadowed individual suffering. Millions of Soviet citizens had died. In that context, the suffering of enemy prisoners carried little weight. American society, distant from the physical destruction of the war, faced different pressures. Public opinion, international scrutiny, and legal obligations influenced policy. Mistreatment of prisoners could damage America's image and undermine claims of moral leadership. This awareness reinforced adherence to standards, even when resources were strained. These divergent approaches produced outcomes that shaped post-war memory. German veterans who had experienced American captivity often spoke of it as harsh but survivable. Those who endured Soviet captivity described it as a prolonged struggle against death itself. These memories were passed down, influencing narratives of the war long after it ended. The difference was not a simple matter of kindness versus cruelty. It was the result of systems operating under radically different conditions. American abundance allowed regulation. Soviet scarcity forced improvisation. American distance allowed detachment. Soviet trauma fueled retribution. Together, these factors created two paths of captivity that could not have been more different. By the midpoint of captivity for many German prisoners, the outcome was already set. In American camps, survival was likely. In Soviet camps, survival was uncertain. This stark divergence was not accidental. It reflected deeper truths about how nations fight wars, how they prepare for peace, and how they treat enemies once the shooting stops. The fate of German prisoners was shaped not only by the war they fought, but by the systems that captured them and the worlds those systems represented. As the war moved closer to its conclusion, the contrasting experiences of German prisoners under American and Soviet control became even more deeply entrenched, shaping not only survival rates, but the long-term psychological impact on those who endured captivity. By this stage, captivity was no longer a temporary interruption in a soldier's life. It had become a defining chapter, one that would influence how former prisoners understood the war, their enemies, and even their own nations for decades to come. In American camps, the later years of the war brought refinements rather than collapse. Administrative systems improved as officials gained experience handling large prisoner populations. Camp commanders relied on manuals, inspections, and standardized procedures. Prisoners were counted, documented, and tracked. Deaths were recorded, causes investigated, and reports filed. This bureaucratic approach may have felt impersonal, but it provided a layer of accountability. A prisoner's life had administrative value, which discouraged arbitrary killing or neglect. Communication with the outside world also mattered. German prisoners in American custody were often allowed to send and receive letters, though censored. Even limited contact with families reinforced a sense of continuity with civilian life. Knowing that someone at home was aware of their survival provided emotional stability. It also reinforced the perception that captivity, while restrictive, was not a complete severing from humanity. Education and reorientation programs expanded in American camps as victory became more likely. Prisoners were exposed to newspapers, lectures, and films presenting democratic institutions and post-war Reconstruction ideas. While not all prisoners accepted these messages, the environment encouraged reflection rather than despair. The underlying assumption was that prisoners would eventually return to society and should not emerge entirely broken or embittered. Violence within American camps existed, but it was usually contained. Conflicts between prisoners, especially between committed Nazis and those seen as disloyal, were a persistent issue. American authorities responded by segregating extremist prisoners and increasing surveillance. The goal was control, not punishment for its own sake. This intervention limited internal terror campaigns that could have made camps far more deadly. In the Soviet system, the end of active combat did not bring relief. For many German prisoners, the post-war period was the most dangerous phase of captivity. The Soviet Union faced immense reconstruction demands. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of citizens were homeless or starving. Prisoners were viewed as a labor resource necessary for national survival. Their continued detention was justified as compensation for the devastation inflicted by Germany. As a result, German prisoners were retained in large numbers long after the war officially ended. Camps remained overcrowded. Rations often declined rather than improved, as the Soviet state redirected resources toward civilian recovery. Medical care remained inadequate. Exhausted bodies that had survived the war years now faced prolonged strain without hope of imminent release. Mortality in Soviet captivity peaked in the immediate post-war years. Weakened by years of deprivation, prisoners succumbed to disease, malnutrition, and accidents. Death became normalized. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves or mass plots. Records, when kept, were incomplete. Families back in Germany often waited years for confirmation, if it ever came. The psychological burden was immense. Unlike American camps, where prisoners could envision a clear endpoint, Soviet captivity offered no timeline. Uncertainty eroded morale. Rumors of release dates circulated endlessly, only to be disproven. This constant cycle of hope and disappointment broke many prisoners more effectively than physical hardship alone. Treatment by guards varied widely, but was shaped by collective memory. Many Soviet guards had lost family members to German invasion. Entire villages had been destroyed. For them, prisoners were reminders of personal tragedy. Acts of cruelty were often framed as justice rather than abuse. This emotional context made restraint difficult and empathy rare. At the same time, Soviet ideology emphasized collective guilt. German prisoners were not simply individual soldiers. They were representatives of an enemy system that had inflicted unprecedented suffering. This worldview reduced incentives to distinguish between levels of responsibility. A conscript and an SS officer could receive similar treatment. The focus was not on rehabilitation, but on extraction of labor and symbolic retribution. In contrast, American policy increasingly emphasized repatriation and reintegration. As Germany surrendered and occupation began, American authorities coordinated transport, documentation, and release schedules. Prisoners returned home, physically weakened, but largely alive. Many carried complex emotions, including relief, gratitude, and confusion about their former enemy's conduct. These differences shaped post-war narratives in profound ways. Former prisoners who had been held by Americans often spoke of captivity as a strange interlude marked by discipline but fairness. Their accounts frequently contrasted sharply with stories from those who survived Soviet camps, whose memories centered on hunger, fear, and prolonged suffering. These divergent experiences influenced how Germans understood both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union during the emerging Cold War. The legacy of captivity extended beyond individual memory. It influenced diplomatic relationships and public opinion. West Germany's alignment with the United States was reinforced by widespread personal experiences of relatively humane treatment. In the East, memories of Soviet captivity contributed to deep mistrust and resentment, even as official narratives attempted to emphasize liberation and anti-fascism. It is important to recognize that neither system existed in a vacuum. American treatment was shaped by material abundance, geographic distance from devastation, legal traditions, and concern for global reputation. Soviet treatment was shaped by existential trauma, resource scarcity, ideological framing, and an urgent need to rebuild. These conditions did not excuse suffering, but they explain why it occurred on such different scales. For German prisoners, fate hinged on geography and timing rather than individual action. Two soldiers from the same unit, captured days apart by different forces, could experience entirely different futures. One might survive, return home, and rebuild a life. The other might vanish into years of forced labor, never to be seen again. This randomness underscores how systems, not just intentions, determine human outcomes in war. As captivity finally ended for the last German prisoners in the early 1950s, the scars remained. Survivors carried physical ailments, psychological trauma, and memories that shaped their worldview. Their stories became part of a larger historical record illustrating how nations treat enemies once they are powerless. The treatment of German prisoners by Americans and Soviets was not merely a footnote to the war. It was a continuation of it by other means. It reflected how each society understood justice, responsibility, and the value of human life after unprecedented violence. In examining these experiences, the contrast reveals more than differences in policy. It exposes the deeper consequences of war on systems, values, and the people caught between them. When German prisoners began entering Soviet captivity in the later stages of the war, the experience was shaped from the very first moment by exhaustion, collapse, and fear. Unlike in the West, where surrender often involved formal procedures and immediate transfer to organized camps, capture in the East was frequently chaotic. Front lines shifted rapidly, units disintegrated, and mass surrenders occurred under extreme conditions. Prisoners were often rounded up by frontline troops who themselves were hungry, traumatized, and operating under minimal logistical support. The initial phase of Soviet captivity was often the most lethal. Prisoners were assembled into columns and marched long distances to rear areas. These marches took place regardless of weather, injury, or physical condition. Food was scarce or non-existent. Water was unreliable. Guards pushed the columns forward relentlessly, driven by orders and fear of losing control. Prisoners who collapsed were frequently left behind. Survival depended on physical endurance, and sheer luck. By the time prisoners reached collection points or camps, many were already severely weakened. Weight loss, untreated wounds, frostbite, and disease were common. Camps themselves varied widely in structure. Some were enclosed facilities with barracks, while others were little more than fenced fields or abandoned buildings. Overcrowding was endemic. Sanitation was minimal. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce. Disease spread rapidly through populations already on the brink of collapse. Food rations in Soviet camps reflected broader shortages across the country. Prisoners typically received thin soup, coarse bread, and occasional grain. Protein was rare. Rations were often tied to labor output. Those who could not work received less food, accelerating decline. This system was not designed to preserve life indefinitely. It was designed to extract labor from those capable of providing it and discard those who could not. Labor assignments were harsh and unrelenting. German prisoners were sent to rebuild cities, repair railways, clear rubble, fell trees, and work in mines. Many of these tasks were dangerous even for healthy workers. For malnourished prisoners, they were deadly. Accidents were frequent. Medical treatment was limited. Injured prisoners were often returned to work before recovery or left to deteriorate. The psychological environment compounded physical suffering. Guards often exercised authority through intimidation. Violence was unpredictable. Punishments could be arbitrary. Prisoners lived in a constant state of uncertainty, unsure whether rules would be enforced consistently or ignored entirely. This unpredictability eroded mental resilience. Fear became a constant companion. Ideology reinforced this environment. Soviet doctrine framed German prisoners as bearers of collective guilt. The devastation inflicted on Soviet territory was immense. Entire regions had been destroyed. Millions of civilians had died. In this context, compassion toward enemy soldiers was rare. Prisoners were seen less as individuals and more as symbols of an enemy system responsible for unimaginable suffering. This ideological framing influenced policy at every level. Repatriation was delayed deliberately. Prisoners were retained as a labor force essential to reconstruction. Their suffering was rationalized as repayment. Official rhetoric emphasized justice rather than mercy. Within this framework, death from exhaustion or disease was not necessarily viewed as a failure of the system. Contrast this with the American approach during the same period. As the war ended in Europe, American authorities increasingly shifted focus toward orderly demobilization. Camps were downsized. Administrative efforts concentrated on processing, documentation, and transport. The goal was to return prisoners to civilian life as quickly as possible while maintaining security. American camps continued to provide stable rations and medical care, even as wartime pressures eased. While shortages existed, especially in Europe immediately after the war, starvation was not a policy tool. Prisoners who fell ill were treated. Those unfit for work were exempted. The system aimed to preserve life rather than extract maximum labor. The difference in time horizons was critical. American policy viewed captivity as temporary. Soviet policy treated it as open-ended. This distinction shaped prisoner psychology. In American camps, prisoners could plan mentally for a future beyond captivity. In Soviet camps, the future was undefined. Days blurred together. Time lost meaning. Survival became the only objective. Social dynamics among prisoners reflected these conditions. In American camps, internal hierarchies existed, but authorities intervened to limit abuse. Extremist elements were isolated. In Soviet camps, internal violence was harder to control. Scarcity intensified competition. Stronger prisoners sometimes exploited weaker ones to survive. Moral boundaries eroded under constant pressure. Mortality statistics reflect these realities. While deaths occurred in American captivity, survival rates were high relative to the scale of imprisonment. In Soviet captivity, mortality reached staggering levels, especially in the immediate post-war years. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners died long after combat had ended. For many families, captivity proved more lethal than the battlefield. The Soviet state did not prioritize transparency. Records were incomplete. Notifications to families were delayed or non-existent. Prisoners who died often disappeared without trace. This absence of closure deepened trauma for relatives and reinforced bitterness toward the captor nation. Over time, these experiences became embedded in collective memory. Survivors returned home with stories that shaped public perception. Accounts of American camps emphasized discipline, fairness, and survival. Accounts of Soviet camps emphasized hunger, brutality, and loss. These narratives influenced post-war alignments, political attitudes, and historical interpretation. It is essential to understand that these outcomes were not the result of individual cruelty alone. They emerged from systems shaped by resources, ideology, and trauma. The Soviet Union fought a war of annihilation on its own soil. Its response to prisoners reflected that reality. The United States fought largely overseas. Its treatment of prisoners reflected distance, abundance, and a strategic interest in post-war stability. For German prisoners, these systemic differences defined life and death. Capture by one side meant hardship, but hope. Capture by the other meant prolonged uncertainty and constant danger. This divergence was not fully understood at the war's outset, but by its end, it was unmistakable. As the post-war years stretched on, Soviet captivity slowly diminished. Prisoners were released in waves, often broken in body and spirit. Their return marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another as they struggled to reintegrate into societies that had changed beyond recognition. Their experiences stand as a stark reminder that the end of fighting does not always mean the end of suffering. The treatment of German prisoners after the war reveals how deeply conflict shapes societies long after the guns fall silent. It shows how systems designed under extreme pressure can perpetuate violence even in peacetime. And it underscores a central truth of modern warfare. The fate of soldiers does not end with surrender. It is determined by the values, capacities, and memories of those who take them captive. As the years passed and the post-war world began to take shape, the long-term consequences of captivity became clearer for German prisoners held by both the Americans and the Soviets. Captivity did not end when the barbed wire came down. Its effects followed survivors home, shaping their physical health, psychological state, and understanding of the war itself. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment continued to echo long after release, influencing memory, politics, and identity. For German prisoners released from American camps, the transition back to civilian life, while difficult, was often manageable. Many returned home weakened, but functional. They carried memories of confinement, but also memories of order and predictability. American camps, for all their restrictions, had preserved routines similar to civilian life. Meals arrived at set times. Work followed schedules. Authority, though absolute, was regulated. This structure eased reintegration. Former prisoners could adapt to post-war society without having to relearn basic norms of behavior. Psychologically, American captivity often left prisoners with complex but not wholly destructive impressions. Many expressed surprise at being treated humanely by a former enemy. This experience challenged years of propaganda that portrayed Americans as brutal or decadent. For some, it planted the first seeds of ideological doubt about the regime they had served. While not all prisoners rejected their previous beliefs, exposure to alternative systems broadened perspectives and softened hostility. Physical recovery was also more attainable. Although prisoners had endured shortages and stress, prolonged starvation was rare. Medical treatment during captivity meant that many chronic conditions were managed rather than ignored. As a result, former prisoners were better equipped to rebuild their lives, work, and support families in devastated post-war Germany. The situation was drastically different for those returning from Soviet captivity. Many came home years later, often in the early 1950s, to a country that had already begun to reconstruct without them. They returned not as soldiers, but as survivors of prolonged deprivation. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and diseases left lasting damage. Tuberculosis, chronic pain, and organ failure were common. Some were permanently disabled, unable to work or care for themselves. Psychological trauma among Soviet returnees was severe. Years of uncertainty, fear, and loss produced deep scars. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, anxiety, emotional withdrawal, and difficulty trusting authority figures were widespread. Reintegration was painful. Families struggled to understand what they had endured. Society often lacked the resources or willingness to provide adequate support. Silence became a coping mechanism. In both East and West Germany, former Soviet prisoners often found little space to speak openly about their experiences. In the East, political narratives emphasized anti-fascist liberation and discouraged discussion of Soviet abuses. In the West, the focus on rebuilding and integration into the Western Alliance sometimes marginalized uncomfortable stories that complicated diplomatic relationships. As a result, many survivors carried their memories privately for decades. These personal experiences fed into broader political dynamics. In West Germany, relatively humane treatment by Americans reinforced positive perceptions of the United States. Millions of Germans had direct or indirect contact with American forces, whether as prisoners, civilians, or workers. These interactions helped normalize cooperation and trust during the early Cold War. Former prisoners became citizens of a new state aligned